I thought kindness would save me. I never thought I was strong, not in the way people describe strength in movies, not loud or fearless or unbreakable, but in quiet, stubborn ways that only show themselves when no one is watching. And when my husband died, that quiet strength was the only thing that kept me standing in the middle of a life that suddenly felt too large and too empty at the same time. The house was silent after the funeral, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until your own thoughts start sounding too loud. And I remember walking from room to room, touching his things, his jacket on the chair, his shoes by the door, his mug still in the sink, and telling myself that love does not disappear just because a heart stops beating, that somehow, in some way, I could still honor what we had by staying connected to the people he loved. His family became my routine. At first, they came with food and soft voices, with stories about how proud he had been of me, how grateful they were that I had stood by him during his illness. And in those early weeks, I clung to them because grief makes you afraid of being alone, and I was terrified of what my life would look like without the shape of his presence inside it. Then the requests began. Small at first, almost shy, always wrapped in apology and embarrassment, his mother explaining that bills had piled up, that his brother was struggling, that they were trying their best but things were hard, and I told myself that families help each other, that this was what he would have wanted, that money was nothing compared to the comfort of knowing I was still part of something. So I sent what I could, every month, without missing a single one. Sometimes it meant skipping things I needed. Sometimes it meant pretending I wasn't tired, that I wasn't scared, that I wasn't calculating every grocery trip like a small financial battle. But I never told them that, because I didn't want my help to feel like a burden they had to acknowledge. I wanted it to feel like love. Years passed like that. And slowly, without me realizing it, my role in their lives shifted from grieving daughter-in-law to reliable source of support, from someone they comforted to someone they depended on. And the calls stopped being about how I was doing and started being about what they needed next. Still, I didn't question it, because when you are kind by nature, you don't look for traps. You look for ways to make things easier for the people around you. And I truly believed that my generosity was healing something, that it was keeping his memory alive in a way that mattered. What I didn't know was that my kindness was being carefully redirected, that the money I sent was never just helping his family survive. It was supporting a life he had hidden from me, a child I never knew existed, and a woman whose name I had never heard, but whose future I had been unknowingly paying for. I found out by accident, the way life often delivers the truths you are not ready to face, through a message on my phone from a stranger who knew far more about my marriage than I did, asking me if I was the woman who used to be married to the man she once loved, and whether I knew that his family had been sending her money every month on his behalf. I stared at those words for a long time before my body reacted, before my heart started racing, before the room began to feel too small, because in that moment I understood that grief had not been the only thing I was carrying all these years. I had also been carrying a lie, and everyone else had known. At first, I wanted to believe that the message was some kind of cruel mistake, that maybe the woman had the wrong person, the wrong story, the wrong past, and that with one simple reply, everything could be cleared up, and my world could return to the version I still desperately wanted to believe in. But the moment she sent me the photos, I knew that hope had no place left to stand. There he was, my husband, standing beside her, with a softness in his eyes I recognized immediately, because it was the same look he once gave me. And beside them was a little girl who looked so much like him that it felt like my lungs forgot how to breathe for a second, because no amount of explanation could erase what biology had already written so clearly on her face. I remember sitting on the floor with my back against the bed, my phone slipping from my fingers, and thinking about all the years I spent believing that grief was the hardest thing I would ever have to survive, not realizing that discovering you were living inside someone else's secret is a different kind of pain, one that makes you question not only the past, but your own ability to see the truth when it is standing right in front of you. When I finally asked her to tell me everything, she didn't hesitate. She told me that he had been with her before we met, that the pregnancy had scared him, that his family convinced him it would be easier to move forward, to pretend the situation did not exist, to build a new life without complications, and that when he married me, they all agreed it would be better if I never knew, that the child would be supported quietly, that everyone would be protected as long as no one spoke too loudly. The money I had been sending was never about family debt. It was child support disguised as family need, and I had been paying it without knowing, trusting people who were thanking me for helping them, while using my help to hide the very truth that would have changed my life if I had known it earlier. What hurt the most was not that he had loved someone before me, or that a child existed somewhere in the world, but that everyone around me had agreed that I did not deserve to make choices with the full truth in my hands, that my kindness made me useful, and that my trust made me convenient. I met her in person a few days later. A small cafe, quiet music, rain sliding down the windows, and a child sitting beside her, coloring quietly, while the adults tried to speak calmly about a situation that had already hurt too many people. And when I looked at that little girl, I felt something shift inside me, because whatever anger I carried, it could not live in the same place as the understanding that she had done nothing wrong, that she was not the product of betrayal, but of fear and cowardice on the part of adults who thought silence was easier than honesty. We talked for hours about how the family controlled contact, how they told her when she could speak and when she could not, how they promised that eventually he would take responsibility properly, how after his death they kept the arrangement going using my money without telling either of us the full truth, keeping both of us dependent on the same people who benefited from keeping us apart. That was when I realized that my role in their story had never been wife or daughter-in-law. It had been provider. And once I saw that, I could not unsee it. Still, I did not confront them right away. Not because I was afraid, but because I finally understood that reacting emotionally would only give them the chance to reshape the narrative again, to paint themselves as victims of misunderstanding, and I was tired of being the person who carried everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. So I went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from weakness, but the kind that listens, observes, and remembers. I stopped sending money without explanation. I began saving messages. I started writing down dates, amounts, conversations that suddenly sounded very different now that I knew what they were really about. And when his mother called asking why nothing had arrived this month, I told her calmly, that I could no longer afford to help, and that I needed to focus on my own stability. And the pause on the other end of the line was long enough for me to understand that she had never imagined I would be the one to set limits. That was the moment I knew something in me had changed, because I was no longer trying to be kind at my own expense. I was trying to be fair to myself, and that, I was learning, made some people very uncomfortable. At first, the pressure came disguised as concern, gentle voices asking whether I was feeling all right, whether work had become too stressful, whether I was sure I wasn't making a decision I would later regret, and I almost admired how quickly they returned to the familiar language of care, as if nothing had changed, and I was still the woman who would soften at the first sign of emotional closeness. But when kindness did not bring the money back, their tone shifted. Subtle disappointment turned into open frustration, and frustration quickly became accusation, reminding me of everything they had done for me, everything my husband had ever sacrificed, every moment they had supported me, as if compassion were a debt that must always be repaid with obedience. And I listened to all of it with a strange calm, because once you recognize manipulation, it loses much of its power to confuse you. Calls became more frequent, messages became longer. Relatives I barely knew suddenly felt entitled to tell me who I was and what kind of person I was becoming. And I realized that while I had been mourning my husband, they had been carefully maintaining a network of shared stories that kept everyone aligned against the one person who could disrupt the arrangement, and now that person was me. They hinted that I was selfish. They suggested that I was emotionally unstable. They warned me that people would start asking questions about why I had suddenly abandoned a grieving family. And for a brief moment, fear tried to settle back into my body, the old fear of being judged, of being misunderstood, of being seen as the problem when I was only trying to survive. But that fear did not last long, because I had already spent years carrying responsibilities that were never mine, and I was no longer willing to let their comfort be built on my exhaustion. Instead of arguing, I started documenting every message, every voicemail, every time they mentioned money and linked it to emotional pressure, every contradiction between what they told me and what they told others. I spoke to a lawyer, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted clarity, and clarity has a way of replacing panic with focus. And in those conversations, I learned that deception does not become harmless just because it is wrapped in family language, that repeated financial pressure can have serious consequences when exposed for what it truly is. Meanwhile, the woman with the child reached out again, frightened, because now the pressure had shifted to her, and she was being told that everything was her fault, that she had ruined arrangements that kept everyone comfortable, that she should have remained grateful and quiet. And hearing that, I recognized the same script being used on both of us, the same emotional strategy applied wherever resistance appeared. So we began talking more openly, sharing messages, comparing timelines, not to build a case, but to understand the full shape of what had been happening behind closed doors for years. And slowly, piece by piece, we realized that what we had thought were isolated decisions were actually part of a long pattern of control that neither of us had created, but both of us had been trapped inside. That was when I understood something important about my husband, too. Not that he was innocent, because he wasn't, but that he had been raised in an environment where avoidance was safer than responsibility, where women absorbed consequences and men were protected from them. And while that understanding did not excuse his choices, it explained why silence had always been easier for him than honesty. But understanding did not mean acceptance, and it did not mean continued sacrifice. As the pressure from his family intensified, threats replaced guilt, vague statements about legal action, about public embarrassment, about consequences that would teach me a lesson, and instead of shrinking, I felt myself growing strangely steady, because now I was no longer alone with the truth. And there is something deeply stabilizing about knowing that reality is on your side, even if people are not. I stopped answering most calls. I communicated only in writing. I let my lawyer handle anything that crossed into intimidation. And while they were busy trying to pull me back into the role they had assigned me, I was quietly rebuilding my own life in ways they never noticed, taking on extra work, finishing courses I had postponed, opening a savings account that belonged only to me. And for the first time since my husband's death, I was making decisions that were not shaped by guilt or obligation, but by the simple question of what would help me survive and heal. I did not feel brave. I felt tired, but tired in a way that no longer led to surrender. Tired in a way that made me choose myself even when it was uncomfortable. And that choice, once made, became impossible to reverse. Because once you stop sacrificing your own stability for other people's convenience, you begin to see just how much strength you had been giving away for free. The moment everything truly changed was not loud or dramatic. It did not come with shouting or public confrontation. It arrived through paperwork, legal language, and meetings where emotions were irrelevant and facts finally mattered more than family stories. And in that space, for the first time, I was no longer the woman they could pressure with guilt or memories. I was simply a person whose resources had been taken under false pretenses. When the lawyer presented the records, the transfers, the messages, and the contradictions in their own statements, I watched faces shift across the table, confidence turning into irritation, irritation into defensive explanations, and explanations into silence, because once lies are written down side by side, they lose the ability to hide behind tone and tears. They tried to reframe it as misunderstanding. They said no one meant to hurt me. They said it was complicated. But complexity does not erase intention, and intention does not disappear just because someone regrets being caught. And in that room, I finally understood that I did not need an apology to move forward. I only needed acknowledgement that what happened was wrong, and that it would not continue. The final decisions were clear. I was not responsible for providing any further support. All future financial arrangements would be handled directly and legally, without intermediaries, without emotional bargaining, without secrecy, and the relief I felt in that moment was not happiness. It was something quieter and deeper. The feeling of being released from a role I had never chosen but had carried for far too long. What surprised me most was not how quickly their power over my life ended, but how empty it felt once it was gone, because I had spent so much time reacting to their needs, their expectations, their narratives, that I had forgotten what it felt like to exist without constant emotional negotiation. I did not celebrate. I went home, sat on my couch, and cried. Not because I was defeated, but because my body was finally allowing itself to release years of tension it had mistaken for normal. In the weeks that followed, I focused on simple things that had once felt impossible: sleeping through the night, planning my finances without panic, saying no without rehearsing excuses in my head, and slowly, almost without noticing, I began to feel like my life belonged to me again. I stayed in touch with the woman and her child, not because of obligation, but because we had both been hurt by the same silence. And in choosing honesty over comfort, we had built something fragile but real, something based not on manipulation, but on shared understanding that neither of us deserved what happened. As for his family, I heard less and less from them, not because they suddenly understood, but because once control is removed, interest often fades, and I no longer mistook that silence for peace or reconciliation. I simply accepted it as the natural end of a relationship built on conditions. Sometimes I still think about my husband, about the man I loved and the man I never fully knew, and I no longer ask myself how he could have done what he did, because I understand now that some people choose the easiest path, even when it hurts others, and understanding that does not mean you have to keep paying the price for their choices. What I learned through all of this is not that kindness is dangerous, but that kindness without boundaries becomes a tool others can use, and that protecting yourself does not make you cold. It makes you honest about your own worth. I did not win. I did not lose. I simply stopped sacrificing my future for a past that had already taken enough from me. And that, I have learned, is sometimes the bravest ending a story can have.